crushed under a burning wagon. A Lakota chief pulled her free and gave her a father for her child. The wheel had come down on her leg just below the knee, and the wagon was on fire. I smelled it before I saw it. The wind was coming off the bluffs from the south that morning, carrying smoke the way smoke travels before a storm, low and fast and thick with something that shouldn't be burning. Cottonwood doesn't smell like that. Neither does prairie grass. That was pine, treated pine, and something else under it. Cloth, maybe, tallow, the things a family owns. We were 3 days out from the village. 4 of us, myself, Chayton, Red Calf, and my nephew Runs Far, who was 16 and still working at keeping his face still when his stomach went sour. We'd come east to look at the crossing at Ash Creek, which the soldiers had been using more often that summer, and I wanted to know how close the ruts were getting to our autumn hunting ground. Not to fight. I was past the age of riding toward a fight for its own sake. I was 51 years old that year, and I had buried enough men to know that a fight you choose is worth less than one you can't walk away from. But we came around the long bend above the creek bed, and there it was. The wagon was on its side. One of the wheels was still spinning slow. The oxen were gone, cut loose or spooked and bolted, I couldn't tell. The canvas was burning on the high side, and the fire had gotten into the wood of the bed, and I could see from 60 yards that the far wheel had pinned something to the ground. I didn't know yet that it was a woman. From that distance, in the smoke and the flat morning light, it looked like a bundle of cloth. Chayton pulled up beside me. He was my age, a hard rider and a man I'd known since we were boys, and he saw what I saw and said nothing for a moment. We both looked around. The bluffs were empty. The creek was empty. Whoever had done this was already 3 miles gone, or they'd never been here at all, which was its own question. A wagon on its side like that with the oxen cut loose might have been a runaway, might have been a raid. The difference mattered. Red Calf had already angled east to read the ground. He came back inside 2 minutes. 1 set of shod horses, he said. 2 men. They came from the north, took the animals, went north again. They didn't burn it. The fires from the lamp inside. So it was a robbery. White men robbing a white family's wagon, which happened more that year than most people understood. The war between the states had been over for nearly a decade by then, but the men it made were still loose in the world. Some of them had settled into something. Some of them hadn't. I told Runs Far to stay back and watch the bluffs, and then I rode in. The wheel had her by the lower leg. She was conscious. That was the first thing I noticed, and it surprised me. A woman in that much pain and smoke and heat ought to have gone somewhere else in her mind, but her eyes were open, and she was looking at me with the particular look of a person who has made a calculation. Not fear. Fear was in there, but something was sitting on top of it, something harder. She said very clearly, "My daughter is under the wagon." I got off my horse. The fire was in the canvas above us, and it was eating toward the wood fast. I could hear it. There's a particular sound that fire makes when it finds something dry and wants it, a low ticking crackle that moves faster than you'd expect, and it was maybe 40 seconds from the underside of the bed, maybe less. Chayton was already off his horse. We looked at the wheel, at the axle, at the angle of the wagon. There was a way to do it. The wagon had come off the trail and rolled left, which meant the high side, the burning side, was the side with all the weight. If we could get 3 men on the tongue and tip it back up even a foot, the wheel would lift. But the tongue was on fire. Chayton read it the same way I did. He stripped off his buffalo robe. He still wore one in the mornings that summer. He was always cold, even in July, and he beat at the tongue with it for a few seconds to clear the flame. Red Calf came in behind him. I got down next to the woman. She was watching me, watching my hands, watching what I was doing, not flinching from the smoke. I said to her, I had enough English by then, not all the words I have now, but enough. I said to her, "Be still. Be still," and we lifted. She said, "Emma's under there, please." The name landed. Emma. She had a name ready for the child, not just my daughter, not just the baby. Emma. It was such a plain, ordinary word to say in that smoke, in that heat. I put my shoulder against the underside of the wheel rim and I called to Chayton and Red Calf. The tongue held their weight just long enough. I felt the wheel shift, felt the load change under my hands, and I drove upward with everything in my legs, everything in my back, everything in the 12 years I'd spent since my first wife died getting hard in ways that didn't show on the outside. The wheel came up. Not much. 8 inches, maybe 10. Enough. She pulled herself clear. She was pulling on her elbows, dragging her leg, and she was not making a sound. Not one sound. I held it. Chayton let go of the tongue, which was beginning to burn through under him, and he reached under the tilted wagon bed. I heard him say something low in Lakota, something you'd say to a frightened animal or a child, and then he came out with a girl who was maybe 3 years old, pressed against his chest, covered in ash and screaming now, screaming, which was a good sound. A screaming child is a living child, and we moved back, all of us, as the wagon came down and the fire found the axle and the whole thing gave way. We stood in the creek grass 30 yards from the burning wagon, and I looked at the woman. Her leg was bad. Not broken through the skin, I thought, but badly crushed, and she'd already lost some blood from a gash on her thigh where the wheel rim had cut her. She was sitting up, holding the little girl against her chest, and her face was gray. She was going to go into shock inside 10 minutes, maybe less. Runs Far was watching from the bluffs. I looked up and caught his eye and made the sign to come down. I looked at the woman again. She was looking at me. Not at Chayton, not at Red Calf, not at Runs Far who was riding down the slope. At me. And she said, I remember the exact words because I have turned them over more times than I can count in the years since. She said, I don't know what you want for this, but I don't have anything to give you. The wagon is gone. They took the money from my husband's coat pocket before they killed him. I've got the clothes on my body and my daughter, and that's the whole of it. That's how I learned her husband was dead. She didn't say it as a plea. She said it as information, as a woman laying out the facts of a situation so there could be no misunderstanding. This is what I have. This is what I don't have. You should know. I said, can you ride? She looked at her leg. She looked at Emma, who had stopped screaming and was now staring at me with enormous wet eyes. She looked back at me. I'll manage, she said. She managed. That was the word for it, for all of it, for everything that came after she managed. But that day it meant she let Red Calf and Chayton lift her onto my horse behind me, without making a sound except one short breath through her teeth when they raised her leg. And she put one arm around my waist and held the little girl against her chest with the other. And she didn't pass out until we were almost an hour out from the creek. When she went limp, I felt it. I caught her arm before she could slide. Chayton rode up close and we shifted her so she was in front of me instead, propped against my chest, with Emma in her lap holding onto her mother's shirt. The little girl had both fists clenched in the cloth. I rode with one arm around them both, and I thought about my daughter, who had died the winter before with her mother, and I did not let myself think about that. We made the village before dark. My full name is Mato Sapa, Black Bear. I had been called that since I was 19 and came back from my first real fight with a claw mark down my left forearm that I still carry. The scar has faded white now, the way old scars do on dark skin, and in certain lights you can barely see it. But it's there. It was always there. I had been chief of my band for 11 years at that point. We were not the largest band of our nation, but we were not small. And we had a reputation that I won't explain except to say that when other bands needed someone to go first across a contested ford, or to sit across from the soldiers' officers and speak for everyone, they sent for us. Or they sent for me. I don't say that to puff myself up. I say it because you need to understand what the woman came into when we rode into that village. She came in on the horse of the chief. That meant something. That meant everything, in fact, in terms of how she would be treated, which was the only thing I had the power to decide at that moment. I could not decide what people thought. I could not decide what the soldiers would eventually do, or what her family back east might say, or what the winter had in store. But I could decide that when she opened her eyes in a Lakota village, she would not be afraid. I had them put her in my lodge. My sister, whose name is Winona, was not entirely pleased about this. Winona had been managing my household since my wife and daughter died, and she had opinions about how things should be done. And one of those opinions was that bringing a wounded white woman and her child directly into the chief's lodge was the kind of decision that had consequences she would be the one managing. She told me all of this while she was already spreading a buffalo robe and calling for the woman who knew about wounds. That was Winona. She disagreed, and then she did the thing. The woman, whose name I learned later was Clara Marsh, was unconscious for most of that first day and part of the night. The wound healer, who was older than anyone in the village could accurately guess, and who smelled permanently of sage and something sharper, spent a long time with Clara's leg. She came out of the lodge once to tell me the bone was cracked but not broken through, and that if the woman's blood was strong she would walk again, and that the gash was clean. I said, "Her blood is strong." The healer looked at me for a moment. She had known me since I was a child, and she had the particular kind of look that very old women develop, the look that says, "I know more about this than you do, and also you are probably right." Emma was with Winona. The little girl had stopped crying somewhere around sundown and had started watching everything with those enormous eyes, and by the time I went to my lodge to sleep she was eating dried chokecherries out of Winona's hand. Children adapt. It is one of the things children do that shames adults when you watch it. I slept on the side of the lodge away from the woman, and I woke twice in the night to check that her breathing was steady. In the morning she was awake. I came in from outside where I'd been checking on the horses, and she was sitting up, and Emma was asleep against her, and she was looking at me with the same eyes she'd had at the wagon. That calculating look, taking in information. "You're the man who lifted the wheel," she said. "Yes." "Where are we?" I told her. The name of the creek nearby, the approximate location relative to Fort Laramie, which she seemed to know. I told her she was safe, that her leg would heal, that she could stay until she was able to travel. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't have anywhere to travel to." I didn't say anything to that. "My husband's family is in Ohio," she said. "I've met them once. We've been in the territory for 2 years. The homestead was northeast of here about 40 miles. There's nothing there now." She paused. "I don't mean there's nothing there. I mean there's nothing there for me. His brother will have a claim on the land that I can't argue with, and I have $12 in a tin inside my boot and a 3-year-old girl." She was not asking for anything. That was the strange thing. She was telling me the situation the same way she'd told me at the wagon. "Here are the facts. I am not hiding anything from you." I said, "You can stay." She looked at me for a long time. I am a man who has spent most of his life being looked at in one way or another, looked at by enemies, looked at by men who wanted something, looked at by young men who wanted to know how to be. But this woman looked at me differently than any of them. She was looking to see if I meant it. "For how long?" she said. "Until you decide something else," I said. She stayed through the summer, and then the fall, and then she stopped planning to leave and started planning for the winter. And by the time the first snow came, she was part of the rhythm of the camp in the way that people become part of things. Not by announcement, not by ceremony, just by being present for enough mornings that her absence would leave a shape. Her leg healed. It took the better part of 2 months, and she walked with a slight pull for another month after that. But by September she was moving without thinking about it. The way you move when your body has forgotten it was ever hurt. Winona made her a walking stick from a straight piece of ash that she didn't need after a while and that she kept anyway. She used it to stir the fire. Emma learned to run in the village the way children learn, by following other children, by falling down and getting up, by working out for herself the new rules of new terrain. The Lakota children called her something that translated approximately as Little White Rabbit, which Emma decided was a compliment, and which I privately thought was accurate. She had a way of going very still when something surprised her, ears up, and then bolting. I watched this from a careful distance for most of the summer. I want to be honest about that. I had not set out to become involved in this woman's life beyond what I'd already done. I had saved her because she was there to be saved. I had given her shelter because the alternative was to leave her and the child on the open plain with a cracked leg, which was not something a man does. These were not complicated moral decisions. They were the decisions you make when you've decided the kind of man you're going to be, and then you just are that man and the decisions aren't decisions anymore. But she was something to watch, Clara Marsh. She had come from somewhere in Pennsylvania, she told me eventually. Her father had been a blacksmith, and she'd grown up in a town where everyone knew everyone's business, and she said she'd left because she was tired of being known before she did anything. Her husband had had the same itch. He'd been a farmer's second son with no inheritance coming, and he'd had the idea about the territory land, and she'd had enough in her, enough of that quality she had, the one I saw first at the Wagon, to say yes to the idea. She told me about him matter-of-factly, not without grief. The grief was in her, I could tell, the way something that's been wrung out tight still carries the shape of what twisted it. But she wasn't performing the grief and she wasn't hiding it. She kept it where it belonged. I told her about my wife, my daughter. We were sitting by the fire outside the lodge one evening in late August, Emma asleep inside, the village quiet around us. It was the kind of evening that comes at the end of a hot day when the air finally cools and everything in the world seems to take a breath. I told her my wife had been taken by the fever the winter before, and my daughter 2 days after. I told her their names, which I don't put here because some things are not for the page. I told her they had been the weight in the center of my life, and that when they died, I had become a man who knew how to keep moving, but did it the way a river moves after a dam, finding the path of least resistance because the original path was closed. She didn't say I'm sorry. She didn't say I understand. She said, that's a long time to keep moving. And something in me shifted. Something that had been braced for years settled a fraction, just a fraction. But a fraction is a beginning. The trouble came, as trouble tends to from outside. In September, a detail of 4 soldiers came into the village. They were looking for a white woman and a child reported missing by a family passing through who'd found the remains of a wagon at Ash Creek and put word in at Fort Laramie. The lieutenant in charge was a young man with the kind of face that hadn't yet decided what it was going to be, too much authority too recently, and not sure how to hold it. He rode in with his hand near his sidearm, which was the kind of thing that made the younger men in my village move toward their weapons without being asked. I came out to meet him. He told me what he was looking for. He was polite enough, in the manner of a man who has been told to be polite, and is following the instruction without having absorbed it. He called me by name, which surprised me. Someone at the fort had told him who I was, and he said there was concern for the woman and child's welfare. I told him they were here. I told him they were well. I told him the woman would speak for herself. Clara came out. She stood next to me and she looked at the lieutenant and she said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the camp, I'm Clara Marsh. My daughter is Emma Marsh. We are guests here. We are safe. We are not being held. She paused. Is there something else you need? The lieutenant looked at her. He looked at me. He looked at her leg, which she was standing on evenly. He looked at Emma, who had appeared at Clara's side and was looking at him with the rabbiteer's expression. Ma'am, he said, there are people who would like to help you get settled. Fort Laramie has resources for. I'm settled, Clara said. The winter can be. I have seen a winter before. The lieutenant was quiet for a moment. Then he said with a sort of careful effort, "Ma'am, you understand there would be talk." Clara turned and looked at me. It was a brief look, quick, but it was the kind of look that carries a conversation inside it, and the conversation was, "Do you need me to say something different?" And my answer was, "No, say what's true." She turned back to the lieutenant. "There's already talk," she said. "That's not a reason for anything, we're well. Thank you for checking." The soldier left. There were people in the village who watched this and drew their own conclusions, and not all of them were wrong. But the ones who watched my face watched it and saw a man standing straight, and nobody said a word to me that required an answer. By October, I had begun to understand what was happening to me, and by November I had stopped arguing with it. It wasn't like the first time. When I was young and I loved my wife, it was like a river in spring, loud, fast, turning everything over, impossible to ignore. This was quieter. This was more like the way the land looks in early morning before the light hits it full, when everything is one color and very still and you can see exactly what's there. What was there was a woman who had looked at me without flinching from the first moment, and who had never once treated me as a foreign thing in my own country. What was there was a child who called me Mato in the way that small children assign names, without ceremony, without explanation, simply because that was my name, and she had decided I was a person who had won. What was there was the particular satisfaction of being needed in ways that did not diminish either of us, of being the steady thing in a camp that had grief in it and uncertainty in it, and the permanent awareness that the soldiers' roots were getting closer. I am a man who has spent a long time being clear-eyed about what is real. You cannot lead people through hard years without that skill. And what was real was that this woman had come into my life like something the land had decided rather than something either of us had chosen, and the land was not wrong. I told Chayton one evening what I was thinking. He was quiet for a while. Chayton is a man who takes his time. Then he said, "She's a good woman." I said, "She is." He said, "She'll have a harder life here than she would somewhere else." I said, "She knows that." He said, "Does she know what you're thinking?" I said, "Not yet." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She probably knows," he said. "Women know earlier than they let on. It's a tactic." I thought about the way she'd looked at me when the soldier was there. I thought about what that look contained. "Maybe," I said. Chayton picked up a stick and turned it in the fire. He said, "She stayed through the summer when she could have gone to the fort. She stayed through the fall. A woman who was planning to leave doesn't learn where the good berry bushes are." That was what Chayton said about it, and it was the most useful thing anyone said to me that year. I spoke to her in December, when the first real snow came down and the world went quiet under it. It was the kind of snow that falls without wind, straight down, the big flat flakes that look slow but pile up faster than the other kind. The village was muffled under it. The fire was going in the lodge, and Emma was asleep, and Winona had gone to her own lodge for the evening, and we were sitting across the fire from each other in the way we'd gotten into the habit of sitting, and I said what I had to say. I did not say it perfectly. I do not have all the words in English still for the things I mean most. I told her she had become something to me. I told her Emma had become something. I told her I was not asking her to choose this life out of gratitude or necessity or because winter was hard. I told her I understood what it would cost her from her own people, from the soldiers, from the world that had opinions about what a white woman should do and where she should be. I told her I could give her safety and a place and work and respect. I told her I could not give her a simple life. I said all of that, and then I stopped and looked at the fire because it was easier than looking at her. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Mato." I looked up. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and her face was the face she had at the wagon, open, direct, taking in the facts of something. But there was something else in it now, something I recognized because I had a name for it now. the same thing that was in me when I looked at her. She said, I made my decision in September. I said, what happened in September? She said, Winona asked me if I wanted to learn to tan hides, and I said yes. I did not follow this immediately. She said, I am not a woman who learns skills I'm not going to use. I don't do things I'm not going to do. She paused. I had $12 in a tin inside my boot. I still have them. I haven't needed to think about them in 3 months. That's not nothing. I sat with that for a moment. She said, the life isn't the hard part. I know how to do hard work. I know how to be cold. I know how to be looked at. She looked at me steadily. You're not a hard part, Motto. You've never been a hard part. The fire cracked. Outside the snow was still falling, straight down in the dark. I said, Emma needs a father. She said, Emma already calls you Motto. I said, that's a name I mean. I know what you mean, she said. She would be very glad. She already follows you around camp hoping you'll lift her onto a horse. She paused. She thinks that's the whole point of horses. She doesn't understand they're for other things. I almost smiled, which was not something I did easily then. She's 3, I said. She's 3, Clara agreed. We sat by the fire a while longer. Outside the snow deepened. The lodge was warm. The child slept. After a while, Clara stood up and came around the fire, and she sat down beside me, and she put her hand on the back of my hand where it rested on my knee, and she did not say anything else. She just put her hand there. I turned my hand over and I held hers. That was the whole of it. That was the moment. We were married in the spring, the way my people do it, and Winona cooked enough food to feed the whole band for 2 days and called it modest. Clara wore a dress that Winona had made for her over the winter, which Clara had known about for months and pretended not to. And Emma wore a small version of the same dress because Winona was that kind of woman. And I stood in front of my people as a chief stands straight, quiet, present, and felt something that I had not felt in almost 2 years. I felt like a man with a reason. Not the reason that comes from duty. Duty I had always had. The reason that comes from inside, from the part of you that was empty and isn't anymore. The part that you didn't admit was empty because it was easier not to. The soldiers came again that spring, different ones. A captain this time with fewer men and a different manner. This one was older and had been in the territory long enough to have some sense in him. He asked to speak with me, and we spoke, and he told me that there had been a formal inquiry into Clara's circumstances, and that the inquiry had been satisfied, and that so long as she remained of her own free will, which they were satisfied she did, the matter was closed from the fort's side. He said this with a kind of careful neutrality that told me he had his own opinions and had decided to keep them. I thanked him. He thanked me for my time. He left without his hand near his sidearm, which I took as progress. Clara was watching from outside the lodge. When he rode out, she came to stand next to me, and she looked at the departing soldiers with her arms crossed and her chin level, and she said, "Well." I said, "Well." She said, "That's done then." It was done. Or rather, that particular thing was done. There were others. There are always others. I will not pretend that the years after were smooth or that the world had no more opinions. The world had opinions right up until it had other things to worry about, and then it had those, and we had our own things in the meantime. Emma grew. She was a serious child who became a serious girl and eventually a serious woman, but she had her mother's quality, the openness, the direct look, the way she stated things plainly. She spoke Lakota before she spoke much English, which was simply a function of where she lived, and she spoke both well in the end. She called me father from the time she was about 5 years old, which was after a conversation I wasn't present for that apparently consisted of Emma deciding to call me father, and then informing Clara of this decision as a settled matter. Clara told me about this conversation, and was trying not to laugh when she did. I said, "Where did she learn that word?" Clara said, I may have used it once or twice. I said, in conversation. She said, in reference. I looked at her. She said, I may have said, your father once or twice when referring to you. I sat with that for a moment. My chest did something that I did not have a word for. I said once or twice. Maybe more, she said, and she smiled the way she smiled when she was being completely honest and also slightly satisfied with herself, which was a particular smile that I knew better than almost anything in the world by then. I want to say something about what it is to be needed in the way she needed me, not the way a drowning person needs a rope. The way a good building needs a good foundation, the need that is also a kind of trust, a settling of weight onto something because you believe it will hold. Clara had managed before me. She had managed in Ohio, and she had managed in the territory, and she had managed at the Wagon and the Smoke, and she would have managed without me in some form, because that was the nature of her. The managing was not the thing she needed. What she needed was to not manage alone. What she needed was to put her hand on something steady and feel it hold, and find that the holding went both ways. There were hard years. There were years when the soldier's presence moved closer, and when the old ways of our life became harder to maintain, and when the losses were the kind that don't announce themselves but accumulate. I'm not going to tell those stories here because they are not mine alone, but through them I was the man I was. I did not become less. I did not flinch or grow small or look for somewhere easier to be. I held what I held. And she saw it. I want to be exact about this because it matters. She saw it. Not once, not at the beginning, she kept seeing it. Through 20 years, she kept turning and finding me there. And every time she turned, I could see in her face that she had half expected not to. The way you half expect the thing you need to be gone because things you need have been gone before. And every time, her face would settle into something quiet and certain. That was the gift. Her seeing, her choosing to keep seeing. The fact that of all the things she could have done, the fort, Ohio, a man from her own people, any of the reasonable things, she had learned to tan hides instead. That was the whole gift. The last winter I want to tell you about, not the last winter, there were many winters after, but the one that matters to this story was the one when I was 57 and I got sick. I had been sick before, but not like this. This started in my chest and worked its way in, and by the third week I could not take a full breath without it costing me something. The healer, who was older than ever and if possible smelled even more of sage, came and did what she knew, and I lay in the lodge and felt the strange, particular helplessness of a man who has spent his life being the one who handles things. Clara sat with me. She did not perform worry, the way some people perform worry, loudly, with commentary, with the need to do something visible. She sat with me in the quiet, practical way she had sat with me through years of things. She kept the fire. She kept me warm. She made me drink things that tasted of the earth and told me firmly to drink all of it. And when I complained, she said I had drunk worse things in my life, and she knew it. She wasn't wrong. On the worst night, when the breathing was hardest, she lay down beside me and put her arm across my chest, not heavy, just present, and she said into the dark, "You are not done. I am telling you that as a fact." I said, "You can't make it a fact by telling me." She said, "I've done it before. I told Emma she wasn't going to fall off that horse, and she didn't." I said, "She did fall off that horse, twice." There was a pause. "She got back on both times," Clara said. "That's the point." The fire was low. Outside, the wind was coming off the plain, the kind of wind that sounds like it means something, like it has a direction in mind. I could feel her arm on my chest, the weight of it, the warmth. She said very quietly, "You pulled me out from under a burning wagon. You can do this." I did not say anything for a while. Then I said, "That was a wheel." "This is a fever," she said. "You've moved heavier things." I don't know if that's what turned it. The healer would have said it was her medicine. Chayton would have said the spirits had their reasons. Clara would have said she'd told me a fact. Maybe all three of them were right. But that night the breathing began to ease, and by morning I was not better, but I was pointed that direction. And 3 weeks later I was on a horse again, and Chayton looked at me like he'd won an argument I'd been losing. There is one more thing. Emma was married when she was 22, to a young man from a family we had known for a long time, a serious, quiet young man who had the quality of looking at a problem until it was solved, which Emma told me was what made her decide. She said she'd watched him look at a problem for 3 hours once without getting frustrated, and she'd thought, well, there it is. I asked her what problem. She said a fence post. I said 3 hours for a fence post. She said it was a good fence post when he was done. I thought about that. I thought about Clara telling me once that she hadn't left because she decided to learn to tan hides. The logic of a woman who knows what she's looking at. At the wedding, Emma stood next to her husband and I stood next to Clara, and there was a moment, after the ceremony, before the eating started, in the particular still second when everyone is in their places and the thing has happened, when Emma looked at me across the space between us. She was wearing her hair the way her mother wore it when I first knew her. She had her mother's posture, back straight, chin level. She had her mother's eyes, that open, direct look. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She just looked at me and I looked at her, and 22 years were in that look, the burning wagon, the village, the snow, the hard years and the good ones, the horse she kept falling off of, all of it. Then she smiled, and it was the smile that was entirely her own, and she turned back to her husband. Clara's hand found mine. She didn't look at me. She was watching Emma, but her hand was there, and I held it the way I had held it through 22 years, the way that stops being a choice and becomes the shape of things, becomes the way your hands know to be. The fire was going, the evening was coming on. The plain was turning gold the way it does in that last hour, that particular gold that looks like something the land does on purpose, like it's showing you what it was before everything and what it will be after. I was 57 years old and I had buried a wife and a daughter and ridden hard miles and made hard decisions and carried the weight of my people through years that tried them. I had been a man the world counted out more than once, for reasons of age and grief and the grinding of history against the lives of the people I loved. And I was standing in the evening with my daughter married and my wife's hand in mine, and the fire warm and the plain golden, and I was, at last, completely certain of something. I had been right to hold. That is the whole story, a wheel. A woman with her back straight and her facts plain. A little girl with rabbit ears. 22 years of the kind of life that doesn't look like anything from the outside but is everything on the inside. The kind that is made not of the big moments but of the small ones, her hand, the fire, the snow falling straight down in the dark, the sound of her voice saying you can do this as a statement of fact. I still hold.